The snow fell thick and heavy that December afternoon when the train wheezed to a stop at Haven Ridge Station. Steam hissed from the locomotive's belly, mixing with the Wyoming cold to create ghostly clouds that drifted across the platform. Frances May stepped down from the third-class car, her worn boots meeting the wooden planks with a solid thud that spoke of a woman who knew how to plant her feet firm against whatever the world might throw. She stood taller than most women had any right to be. According to the whispers that followed her from Kansas, her shoulders were broad from years of working other people's gardens, her hands rough from soil and sun. At 28, she carried herself with the peculiar dignity of someone who had long since stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. The December wind caught at her dark wool coat, revealing a plain brown dress beneath, practical and unadorned. In her left hand, she clutched a carpet bag that held everything she owned. In her right, a letter carefully folded and refolded until the creases had worn soft, promising work at a cattle ranch called Brook Hill. The position was for household help, cooking and mending for the ranch hands. It wasn't much, but it was honest work. And Frances had learned long ago that honest work was worth more than pretty promises. The platform was near empty, save for a few merchants loading goods and a cowboy leaning against a post near the station house. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent more time in the saddle than at the table. His hat shadowed his face, but Frances could see enough weathered skin, a day's worth of stubble, and eyes that had seen their share of long horizons. A scar traced a pale line along his left cheek, disappearing into the stubble like a creek running dry. He straightened as she approached, and she noticed how he moved careful, deliberate, like a man who had learned not to waste motion. His clothes were clean, but worn leather chaps over denim, a sheepskin coat that had seen better winters, boots that had walked many miles. "Miss May," his voice was low, roughened by wind and few words. "That's right." She met his gaze straight on, chin lifted. She'd learned that looking away only invited assumptions she couldn't afford. He studied her for a moment, and she saw something flicker across his face, not disappointment exactly, but a kind of recalibration, as if he were adjusting a picture in his mind to match the reality before him. She knew what he saw: a woman too tall, too broad, too much of everything that ladies' magazines said she shouldn't be. "I'm Silas Brooke," he said finally. "Sent to fetch you to the ranch." Frances waited for what usually came next, the polite suggestion that perhaps there had been some mistake, that surely a woman of her stature hadn't intended to apply for domestic work. But Silas only gestured toward a wagon waiting beyond the platform, where two horses stood patient in the falling snow. "I didn't think you'd be—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "Like I am," Frances supplied, her tone neither defensive nor apologetic, merely factual. A ghost of something, perhaps amusement, touched his lips. "Was going to say, traveling so light. Most folks bring trunks." She glanced at her single carpet bag. "Never saw the point in carrying what you don't need." He nodded, taking the bag from her before she could protest. "Ranch is 2 hours north. Best get moving before the snow gets worse." The wagon was simple but well-maintained, with a bench seat that had been mended with neat stitches. Silas helped her up with a matter-of-fact courtesy that held no flourish, then climbed up beside her. The horses responded to his quiet click of tongue, and they rolled away from the station into the white silence of the Wyoming winter. For the first mile, neither spoke. Frances had learned the value of quiet, how it could be a gift rather than an awkwardness. She studied the landscape, rolling hills softened by snow, distant mountains like pale ghosts against the gray sky. Somewhere out there was Brook Hill Ranch, and whatever future waited for her there. "You come far?" Silas asked eventually, his eyes on the road. "Kansas, town called Millbrook. Long journey?" "Yes." She didn't elaborate on the failed engagement. The man who'd told her she was too much too tall, too strong, too unwilling to simper and shrink. She didn't mention the whispers that followed her through Millbrook's streets, or the relief she'd felt seeing that advertisement for help wanted, far away in Wyoming territory. "Ranch work ain't easy," Silas said after another stretch of quiet, "especially in winter. Neither is starving." He glanced at her then, a quick sideways look that took in her straight spine, her steady hands, the way she didn't huddle against the cold but met it head on. "Suppose that's true enough." The snow thickened as they traveled, transforming the world into a study in white and gray. Frances had never seen country quite like this, vast and unforgiving, beautiful in its harshness. It made her feel small in a way that was oddly comforting, as if here, finally, was something bigger than the disapproval that had dogged her steps in Kansas. "That letter you sent," Silas said suddenly. "Your writing was clear, educated." "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married." Frances kept her voice neutral. "She believed in teaching her daughters to read and figure, same as her sons would have been." "Sensible woman." "She was." Frances didn't add that her mother had also taught her to keep her chin up and her backbone straight, no matter what the world said about women who refused to fold themselves small. The wagon hit a rough patch, jostling them both. Silas steadied the reins with practiced ease, murmuring something low to the horses. Frances noticed his hands scarred and capable, the hands of a man who worked with rope and leather, wood and iron. "Brook Hill's not fancy," he said as they crested a low rise. "But it's solid. Good land, good stock. We run about 300 head. More in good years." "And the house help?" "Been making do since old Martha passed last spring. The hands aren't particular about their food, long as there's plenty of it, but the house," he shrugged. "Could use a woman's touch, I suppose." Frances almost smiled at that. Her touch had never been particularly womanly, according to the standards of Millbrook society, but she could cook a meal that would stick to a man's ribs, mend a shirt so the patches held through hard wear, and keep a house clean enough to satisfy anyone but the fussiest church ladies. "How many hands?" "6 regular, more during roundup and drives. They bunk in the old cabin. You'll have a room in the main house." He paused. "My grandmother's room. It's small, but private." Privacy. The word was sweet as honey after years of boarding houses and borrowed corners. "That sounds fine." They were descending now, following a track that wound between snow-laden pines, through the trees. Frances caught glimpses of buildings, a barn, corrals, and finally, the house itself. It was 2 stories of weathered timber and stone, solid and unpretentious, with smoke rising from 2 chimneys. Not grand, but as Silas had said, solid. "Welcome to Brook Hill," Silas said, and Frances heard something in his voice, pride, perhaps, or merely the satisfaction of a man who had built something worth having. As they pulled into the yard, she saw faces appear at the bunkhouse window, the ranch hands. No doubt, curious about the new help. Let them look, she thought. She was done with trying to be something other than what she was. Silas helped her down from the wagon, and for a moment they stood facing each other in the swirling snow. He was studying her again, but not in the way men usually did, not measuring her against some ideal and finding her wanting, but simply seeing her, as if trying to understand what manner of woman would travel so far with so little, seeking nothing more than work and a roof. "I'll show you to your room," he said finally. "You can settle in, then I'll introduce you to the kitchen. Expect you're tired from the journey." "I'm fine," Frances said, because she had learned long ago that admitting to weakness only invited its exploitation. "I can start tomorrow, if that suits." He nodded, accepting her words without question. Tomorrow, then. As he led her toward the house, Frances felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a cautious flutter of hope. Perhaps here, in this snow-quiet place with its taciturn owner and promise of honest work, she might find what had eluded her in Kansas, a life where she could stand at her full height without apology. The door opened before them, solid wood that spoke of craftsmanship and care. Silas gestured her inside, and Frances May stepped across the threshold into whatever future waited beyond. The house smelled of wood smoke and leather, coffee and the faint mustiness of a place too long without proper airing. Silas led Frances through a main room dominated by a stone fireplace, past furniture that spoke of function over fashion, a worn horsehair sofa, 2 ladder-back chairs, a table scarred by years of use. Everything was clean enough, but she could see where a woman's hand had been absent dust in the corners, windows that wanted washing, a general air of making do. "Kitchen's through here," Silas said, pushing open a door to reveal a large room with a cast-iron stove, a sturdy work table, and shelves lined with preserves and dry goods. Martha kept it well stocked. Haven't had the heart to change much. Frances ran her hand along the work table's smooth surface, worn silky by years of kneading and chopping. A good kitchen, built for feeding hungry men who worked hard and needed fuel to match. She could work with this. "And the room!" He led her back through the main room to a narrow staircase. "Upstairs. The hands know not to come up here, it's private quarters." The stairs creaked under their weight, each step announcing their presence to the quiet house. At the landing, Silas turned left down a short hallway. There were 3 doors, one at the end, clearly the master bedroom, one that stood ajar revealing a washroom, and one on the right that Silas opened with an oddly gentle touch. "This was Gran's room," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. It was small, as he'd warned, but clean and surprisingly welcoming. A single bed with an iron frame sat against one wall, covered by a quilt that must have been made by the grandmother's hands tiny, even stitches in a pattern of interlocking rings, a chest of drawers, a washstand with pitcher and bowl, a small window that looked out over the snow-covered corrals, plain muslin curtains, yellowed with age but whole. Frances set her carpetbag on the floor and stood in the center of the room, taking it in. After years of sleeping in corners and borrowed spaces, this small room felt like a kingdom. "It's perfect," she said, then felt heat rise in her cheeks at the emotion that had crept into her voice. Silas was watching her from the doorway, and she saw understanding in his eyes. He knew what it meant to have a space that was yours alone. He started, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with words. "There's something I should tell you. About the bed." Frances turned to look at him, eyebrows raised. "It was my bed, originally. When I was young, Gran took it when her rheumatism got bad and she couldn't manage the stairs to her old room anymore. Just thought you should know, in case that matters to you." Frances looked at the narrow bed again, imagining a young Silas sleeping there, probably with his boots sticking off the end even as a boy. The thought should have been uncomfortable sleeping in a bed that had belonged to her employer, but instead it seemed merely practical. Furniture was furniture, after all. Still, something made her voice catch slightly as she said, "I've never slept in a man's bed before." The words hung in the air between them, and Frances immediately wished she could call them back. What a thing to say, like some nervous bride instead of a woman of 28 who had come here to work. But Silas didn't laugh or make the kind of joke rough men might. Instead, he stepped into the room with that same deliberate care she'd noticed before. He reached for the quilt, pulled it back to reveal clean, if worn, sheets beneath. "Well then," he said, his voice low and matter-of-fact, "you just focus on getting a good night's rest. That's all a bed's for, after all." He smoothed the sheet with one calloused hand, a gesture so unexpected and gentle that Frances found herself holding her breath. Then he straightened, nodded to her, and moved back toward the door. "Supper's at 6. Nothing fancy tonight, just stew and biscuits. You can meet the hands then, if you're feeling up to it. Or I can bring you something up here, if you'd rather." "I'll come down," Frances said quickly. "Better to face them all at once. Get the staring and measuring over with." "Good." He paused at the threshold. "Frances, can I call you Frances?"
"Yes."
"I hired you because your letter showed sense and capability. Didn't say anything about what you looked like or how you carried yourself. That's not my business. My business is running this ranch, and I need someone who can do the work. Clear. Clear. He nodded once more and was gone, his boots echoing on the stairs. Frances sank onto the edge of the bed, Silas's childhood bed. She thought with a twist of something she couldn't name. The mattress was firm, the quilt soft under her hands. She unpacked slowly, placing her few belongings in the chest of drawers, 2 work dresses, undergarments mended so many times they were more thread than fabric, her mother's Bible, a small sewing kit, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, one good dress. Dove gray wool, simply made but well cut. She'd sewn it herself for her engagement, back when she'd still believed Alfred Harrington would stand by his proposal despite the whispers. She hung it in the small wardrobe, then paused. What use would she have for such a dress here? But she left it hanging anyway, a reminder of who she had been and who she had chosen to become. By the time she descended for supper, the smell of stew had filled the house. She found the kitchen occupied by 6 men who stood awkwardly as she entered, hats in hand like schoolboys called before the teacher. They ranged in age from barely 20 to past 60, all sharing the lean, weathered look of men who lived by rope and saddle. Silas made introductions with minimal fuss. "Boys, this is Miss May. She'll be keeping house and feeding you lot. Francis, this is Tom Rivers, my foreman." Tom was the oldest, with silver in his beard and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "Ma'am." Henry Sutton and Jake Sutton. Brothers, clearly with matching sandy hair and shy grins. Carl Brennan, a compact man with scarred hands and a direct gaze. Will Tucker, the youngest, all knees and elbows and barely controlled energy. And Moses Freeman, a tall black man with gray at his temples and an air of quiet dignity. Each man nodded as introduced, and Frances nodded back, meeting their eyes steadily. She saw the surprise in some faces at her height, her broad shoulders, the way she stood straight instead of trying to shrink. But she also saw acceptance. Ranch folk judged by different standards than town people. Out here, what mattered was whether you could pull your weight. "Pleased to meet you all," she said. "I understand you've been making do since Martha passed. I'll do my best to fill her shoes, though I hear they're considerable ones to fill." Martha was a force of nature, Tom allowed with a grin. "But we're not hard to please, ma'am. Hot food and plenty of it. Clothes that don't fall apart, that's about all we need." They ate together at the long kitchen table, Frances taking Martha's place at the foot, while Silas sat at the head. The stew was simple but good. The biscuits light despite being made by Silas's unpracticed hand. The men talked easily among themselves about the cattle, the weather, plans for spring roundup. They included her naturally in the conversation, asking about her journey, her thoughts on the Wyoming cold compared to Kansas. She found herself relaxing incrementally. These were working men, honest and direct. They didn't care that she was too tall or that her hands were rough. They cared that she laughed at Will's terrible jokes and promised to make pie if someone could find her some preserved peaches. As the meal wound down and the men began to drift back to the bunkhouse, Moses lingered. "Miss May," he said quietly, "I do some leather work in the evenings. If you need anything mended or made holsters, belts, such like, you just let me know." "Thank you, Mr. Freeman. That's kind of you." He smiled. "Moses is fine. Ma'am, we don't stand much on formality out here." When they were gone and she was washing dishes, Silas had offered to help, but she'd waved him off. She found a rhythm in the work that soothed something in her chest. Hot water, soap, the squeak of clean plates. Simple things, but satisfying. Silas appeared in the doorway as she was finishing. "You did well tonight." "They seem like good men." "They are. Every one of them." He hesitated. "That offer stands. By the way, about bringing meals up to your room. If you'd prefer. Some women. Well, some wouldn't want to eat with the hands." Frances dried her hands on her apron, Martha's apron. which hung on a peg by the stove and fit her better than most. "I'm not some women." "No," he agreed quietly. "You're not." Later, lying in the narrow bed with its quilt pulled up to her chin, Frances stared at the ceiling and thought about the strangeness of the day. This morning she'd woken in a boarding house in Cheyenne, surrounded by the smell of cabbage and other people's troubles. Tonight she lay in a bed that had sheltered both a boy and his grandmother, in a house that smelled of leather and coffee, employed by a man who looked at her straight and saw her worth measured in work, not waists or wiles. She thought of Silas pulling back the covers, that simple gesture of welcome, such a small thing, but it had loosened something tight in her chest. When was the last time someone had shown her simple kindness without expecting anything in return? The wind rattled the window, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. Frances closed her eyes and, for the first time in months, slept without dreams. The rhythm of ranch life settled around Frances like a well-worn coat. She rose before dawn to start the coffee and biscuits, the kitchen dark except for the glow of the stove. By the time the men stumbled in, rubbing sleep from their eyes, she had hot food waiting, flapjacks and bacon, eggs when the hens were laying, always plenty of strong coffee. Within 2 weeks, she had the house running with the kind of quiet efficiency that made the men wonder how they'd ever managed without her. Clothes appeared mended in their bunks, boots found themselves oiled, and meals arrived hot and plentiful no matter how long the workday stretched. But Frances didn't stop at traditional household work. The 3rd week, Tom found her in the barn, examining a harness with a broken buckle. "I can fix that, ma'am," he offered. She looked up from where she was already working a leather punch. "No need. My father kept draft horses. I've mended plenty of tack." He watched her work, strong hands steady, movements sure. "Well, I'll be—" Word spread quickly among the hands. The new housekeeper could mend leather, shoe a horse in a pinch, and wasn't afraid of getting her hands dirty. When Henry's saddle needed restitching, he brought it to her instead of waiting for the traveling leather worker. When a section of corral fence needed emergency repair during a storm, she was out there with hammer and nails alongside the men. Silas observed it all with his characteristic quiet. He never commented when he found her helping Moses doctor a horse's split hoof, or when she took it upon herself to reorganize the tool shed. But she noticed his nods of approval, the way his eyes would find hers across the yard and hold for a moment before moving on. One evening in late January, Frances was kneading bread when she heard commotion from the barn. Through the kitchen window, she saw the men gathered around something on the ground. Without thought, she grabbed Martha's old coat from its peg and hurried out. Will Tucker lay in the mud, his face white with pain, his left arm bent at an unnatural angle. He'd been thrown from a green horse. Tom explained. His arm was clearly broken. "Someone needs to ride for Doc Harlan." Carl said. "That's 3 hours in this weather," Moses pointed out. "Boy needs tending now." Frances knelt beside Will, her hands gentle as she examined the break. Clean, thankfully, though the bone was displaced. She'd seen worse on her father's farm. "I can set it," she said quietly. The men exchanged glances. Silas stepped forward. "You've done this before?" "3 times, 2 on horses, once on my brother when he fell from the hayloft." She met his eyes steadily. "It needs doing now, before the swelling gets worse." Silas held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "What do you need?" She sent Jake for clean cloth and 2 straight pieces of wood from the kindling pile. Moses held Will's shoulders while Tom gripped his hand. Frances positioned herself, feeling along the break with practiced fingers. "This will hurt," she told Will, who was trying hard not to cry. "But quick is better than slow. You ready?" The boy nodded, jaw clenched. Frances drew a breath, then pulled and twisted in one smooth motion. Will's scream cut through the evening air, but the bone slipped back into place. She splinted it quickly, wrapping it tight with torn strips of cloth. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. Keep it still and elevated. We'll still want Doc Harlan to look at it, but it should heal clean now. Will's color was already better. Thank you, ma'am, he managed through gritted teeth. As the men helped Will to the bunkhouse, Silas lingered. Frances was washing her hands in the horse trough, her movements matter of fact. That was well done, he said. She shrugged. Needs doing. You do it. Not everyone sees it that way. Not everyone can. He paused. Where'd you learn? Here and there. My mother knew herbcraft and basic doctoring. My father believed in being useful. She dried her hands on her skirt. Never thought I'd need it out here, but I suppose skills follow where you go. That they do. He studied her in the fading light. You're full of surprises. Frances May. Am I? She tried to read his expression. I'm just doing what needs doing. Maybe that's the surprise. That night, she found a package on her bed. Inside was a leather journal, well made with Moses's careful stitching, and a note in Silas' careful hand. For doctoring records, seems we have ourselves a healer as well as a housekeeper. S.B. Frances ran her fingers over the smooth leather, something warm blooming in her chest. She'd been given gifts before Alfred had presented her with a cameo brooch when they'd gotten engaged, all proper and expected. But this was different. This was recognition of who she was, not who she should be. As winter deepened, she found herself settling into the rhythm of Brook Hill in ways that surprised her. The men treated her as one of them, still respectful, still calling her ma'am, but including her in their easy camaraderie. When she mentioned that the henhouse needed expanding, Carl and Jake took it on without being asked. When her boots wore through, Moses presented her with a new pair he'd made, sturdy and plain and exactly right. And Silas was a constant presence without being intrusive. He had a way of being there when something needed doing, holding a ladder when she cleaned the high windows, appearing with firewood just as the kitchen box ran low. They developed a pattern of evening talks, sitting by the kitchen fire after the supper dishes were done, discussing ranch business and plans for spring. You're not what I expected, he told her one night as she darned socks and he worked on the account books. What did you expect? Someone like Martha, I suppose. Older, settled. Not someone who'd reset bones and mend fences. Frances kept her eyes on her work. Disappointed? No. The word came quick and firm. No, not disappointed. She looked up then, meeting his eyes across the kitchen table. Something passed between them. Unnamed, but understood. Then he went back to his figures and she to her darning, the fire crackling between them. But the past has a way of following, even to the Wyoming wilderness. One afternoon in early February, Frances was feeding the chickens when she saw a figure on horseback approaching. As the rider drew closer, her heart sank. She knew that posture, that self-important way of sitting a horse. Alfred Harrington dismounted in the yard like he owned it, his city clothes absurdly out of place against the backdrop of barn and snow. He was handsome still, in that polished way that had once turned her head. But now she saw the weakness in his mouth, the calculating look in his eyes. Frances, he said, removing his hat with a flourish. I've come to take you home. She set down the feed bucket carefully. This is my home now. Don't be ridiculous. You can't mean to stay in this. He gestured dismissively at the ranch. This wilderness, I've reconsidered. Mother has agreed to the match. Despite your limitations, we can be married by spring. My limitations? Her voice was flat. Your height, your manner, your insistence on speaking your mind. But I'm willing to overlook all that. You should be grateful. I think you should leave. Silas's voice cut through Alfred's speech. He stood in the barn doorway, and though he hadn't raised his voice, something in his stance made Alfred step back. And who are you? Alfred demanded, recovering his bluster. The man who employs Miss May, and the man asking you to get off his property. Alfred turned back to Frances. You can't prefer this to what I'm offering. A proper home, a position in society. A lifetime of being told I'm too much, Francis interrupted. Of making myself smaller so you can feel bigger. No thank you, Alfred. I prefer honest work to dishonest promises. His face flushed ugly red. You'll regret this. No other man will have you, not a woman like you. Good, Francis said quietly. I'm not looking to be had. Alfred spluttered, but another look at Silas, who had moved closer. His hand resting casual-like near his hip decided him. He mounted his horse with less grace than he dismounted and rode away without another word. Francis stood frozen in the yard, watching him disappear into the distance. She didn't realize she was shaking until Silas touched her elbow gently. You all right? I'm fine, but her voice cracked on the words. Come on, he said. Let's get you inside. I'll finish the chickens. I know you can, but you don't have to, not right now. He steered her into the kitchen, poured her coffee from the pot that always stood ready. She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her bones. That was your intended? Silas asked after a moment. Was, until he decided I was too much trouble, she laughed, but it came out bitter. His mother said I was mannish, said no proper man would want a wife who could look him in the eye without craning her neck. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then, my grandmother was tall, nearly 6 feet. My grandfather used to say he married her because he got tired of looking down at the tops of women's heads. Said he wanted someone he could look at straight on, see what was in their eyes. Francis looked at him, startled. She was strong too, he continued. Helped build this house, stone by stone, worked cattle alongside him until the day she died. Some folks talked, said she wasn't natural. But Grandpa, he just said they were jealous they didn't have a woman who could pull her weight and carry her own saddle. She sounds wonderful. She was. He met her eyes. You remind me of her sometimes. The way you don't apologize for taking up space. The way you just do what needs doing. Francis felt tears prick her eyes. That's kind of you to say. Not kind. True. He stood. That man Alfred, he's a fool. Most would say he's offering me more than I deserve. Most people are fools too. He paused at the door. Francis, don't make yourself smaller. Not for him, not for anyone. World's got enough small people in it already. That night, Francis lay in bed thinking about Silas's grandmother, building a house stone by stone, about Moses's quiet dignity, Tom's easy acceptance, Will's grateful eyes when she'd set his arm, about Silas himself, who looked at her straight and saw not what she should be, but what she was. Outside, snow began to fall again, muffling the world in white silence. But inside, for the first time in her life, Francis felt the warmth of being exactly where and who she was meant to be. The river crossing at Willow Bend had always been treacherous in winter, but that March morning it looked particularly unwelcoming. The spring thaw had begun early, turning the ice uncertain and the banks to mud. Francis stood with the supply wagon, watching Silas and Tom debate the safest road across. Could wait another week, Tom suggested, eyeing the dark water showing through cracks in the ice. Could, Silas agreed. But we need those supplies. The boys are already down to their last tobacco, and Francis has been making do without proper flour for 2 weeks now. Francis had insisted she could manage with what they had, but Silas had overruled her. You've stretched every bit of food to feed us all winter. Least we can do is get you proper supplies to work with. They decided to cross at the narrow point, where the ice looked thickest. The supply wagon would go first, with Carl driving and Jake riding alongside. The rest would follow on horseback once the wagon was safely across. Francis watched from the bank as Carl urged the team forward. The horses were nervous, their breath clouding in the cold morning air. Everything seemed fine until they reached the middle of the river. Then came the crack sharp as a rifle shot. Move, Silas shouted, but it was too late. The ice gave way beneath the wagon's rear wheels, tilting the whole thing toward the dark water. Carl jumped clear, but Jake's horse slipped on the breaking ice, throwing him hard before scrambling to solid ground. Jake hit the edge of the ice shelf and slid toward the open water. Without thinking, Frances was moving. She grabbed a coil of rope from Silas's saddle and ran onto the ice, dropping to her belly to distribute her weight as she'd learned as a child on Kansas pond ice. "Frances, no!" She heard Silas behind her, but didn't stop. Jake was clinging to the ice edge, his fingers already turning blue. She threw the rope with the skill of someone who'd helped rope cattle all winter. "Grab on!" Jake caught it, but as he tried to pull himself up, she felt herself sliding toward him. Then strong hands gripped her ankles, Moses and Henry, who'd followed her onto the ice. Together they pulled as Jake held tight, dragging him onto solid ice. But the effort cost her. As Jake scrambled to safety, Frances felt the ice beneath her crack. She rolled sideways, trying for thicker ice, but her heavy skirts, now soaked with freezing water, dragged her down. The world tilted, and suddenly she was in the water, the cold so sharp it drove all breath from her lungs. Hands reached for her Silas's hands. She realized, dimly, he'd thrown himself flat on the ice edge, gripping her arms with desperate strength. "Hold on!" She tried, but the cold was like nothing she'd ever felt, turning her muscles to stone. Her sodden skirts pulled her down like anchors, just as her numb fingers began to slip from his grasp. Tom appeared beside Silas, adding his strength. Together they hauled her onto the ice and then to shore. She lay gasping on the muddy bank, unable to stop shaking. Silas was already stripping off his coat, wrapping it around her. "Get her to the house," he ordered. "Now!" The ride back was a blur. She was vaguely aware of being lifted from a horse, of warm hands and worried voices. Then she was in the kitchen, and someone Silas was working at the buttons of her frozen dress with fingers that shook nearly as much as hers. "Have to get you warm," he muttered, his usual composure cracked. "Moses, get every blanket in the house. Henry, stoke that fire hot as it'll go." Frances wanted to tell him she was fine, but her teeth were chattering too hard to speak. He peeled away the frozen layers with clinical efficiency, down to her chemise, then wrapped her in blankets and settled her in a chair by the fire. Only then did she see that his own clothes were soaked through from lying on the ice. "You'll catch your death," she managed through chattering teeth. "Worry about yourself," he said roughly, but she saw the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he poured coffee and pressed the mug into her hands. "What were you thinking, going out on that ice?" "Same thing you were when you reached for me." He stared at her, then shook his head. "You could have died. So could Jake." "Jake's not." He stopped, jaw clenched. "Not what?" "Not my responsibility the way you are." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was ready to examine. Then Will burst in with news that they'd saved most of the wagon contents, and the moment passed. But something had shifted. As Frances recovered from her icy plunge, Moses fussing over her with hot soup, the younger hands treating her like spun glass, she noticed Silas watching her with a new intensity. Not the measured assessment of an employer, but something deeper, more personal. She noticed other things too. How he found excuses to check on her progress. How his hand lingered when he helped her with her coat. How he started taking his evening coffee in the kitchen instead of his study. Their quiet conversations stretching later into the night. One evening, as she worked on patching Jake's coat, the boy had torn it badly in the river incident. Silas cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about hiring more help," he said abruptly. Frances's needle stilled. "Am I not sufficient?" "That's not—" He ran a hand through his hair. A gesture she'd learned meant he was struggling for words. "You do the work of 3 people. That's the problem. You shouldn't have to. I don't mind the work." "I know you don't, but I mind watching you work yourself to exhaustion. I mind that you were out fixing fence yesterday when you should have been resting. I mind—" He stopped, stood abruptly. "Just think about it, please." He left before she could respond. Frances stared after him, her heart doing strange things in her chest. She'd worked for him 3 months now, and in that time she'd learned to read his silences, his small gestures. What she saw in him lately made her hands unsteady and her breath catch at unexpected moments. But she'd been wrong before. About Alfred. Had thought she'd seen affection where there was only tolerance, acceptance where there was only resignation to social expectation. She wouldn't make that mistake again. The next morning brought a surprise. Tom approached her after breakfast, hat in hand. "Miss Frances, the boys and I've been talking about the river and all. If this is about Jake, I've told him 10 times. It's not about Jake. Well, not exactly." He twisted his hat. "Thing is, we've been here longer than you, but you're as much a part of this ranch as any of us now. More, maybe, and we wanted to." He thrust something at her. "Here." It was a sheath knife. The leather worked with Moses's careful skill, the handle carved from elk antler. On the sheath was tooled to design mountains and stars, and in the center, her initials. "We figured anyone brave enough to go out on breaking ice ought to have proper tools," Tom said gruffly. "Can't have you trying to cut rope with kitchen knives." Frances turned the knife over in her hands. Throat tight. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say nothing. Just wear it. You're one of us now, and we look after our own." She strapped the sheath to her belt, where it hung strange but right. When she looked up, Silas was watching from the doorway, something soft and proud in his expression. That afternoon, she was in the barn checking on a sick calf when she heard horses in the yard, multiple horses, and voices she didn't recognize. She stepped out to see 3 men dismounting, led by someone she recognized from town, Boyd Harper, who owned the neighboring ranch. "Brooke," Harper called out as Silas emerged from the house. "Need to talk to you about water rights." They gathered in the yard, Silas and Tom facing the 3 visitors. Frances hung back by the barn, but close enough to hear. "That stream that cuts through Willow Valley," Harper began. "Been thinking it's time we formalized who gets what water." "Never needed formalizing before," Silas said evenly. "Things change. Town's growing. Land's getting more valuable." Harper's eyes swept the ranch, lingering on Frances. "Man in your position ought to think about the future. Maybe take a wife. Start building something more than just a working ranch." "My plans are my own business." Sure. Just saying. The Clearwater family's got that daughter coming of age. Pretty little thing, good connections. Could see you moving up in the world with a match like that. Better than..." His eyes flicked to Frances again. "Current arrangements." Frances felt heat rise in her cheeks. But before she could retreat, Silas stepped forward. "Let me be clear. Harper, the water rights stand as they've always stood. And if you've got opinions about how I run my ranch or who I employ, you can keep them to yourself." His voice was still even, but there was steel underneath. "Now, if that's all you came to say, you know the way out." Harper's face darkened. "No need to be unfriendly, Brooke, just offering neighborly advice." "Advice I didn't ask for and don't need." The men left with muttered farewells and dark looks, as their horses disappeared down the road. Silas turned to find Frances still standing by the barn. "I don't let men like Harper." "I know what men like Harper think," Frances interrupted quietly. "He's not wrong. A match with the Clearwater girl would be advantageous." Silas crossed to her in 3 strides. "Frances, I should check on that calf." She turned away, but he caught her arm gently. "Will you listen for once?" His voice was rough. "I don't want the Clearwater girl. I don't want advantageous matches or moving up in anyone's world but my own." "What do you want?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, soft, "I want someone who pulls drowning boys from rivers without thinking twice. Someone who sets bones and mends fences and makes the best biscuits in Wyoming. Someone who stands tall and doesn't apologize for it." Francis's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it.
Silas.
I know I'm not much, he continued, words coming faster now like a dam had broken. Just a rancher with calloused hands and not much conversation. I know you could do better.
Stop.
She pressed her fingers to his lips, surprising them both. Just stop. They stood frozen for a moment, her fingers against his mouth, his hand still on her arm. Then she dropped her hand and stepped back. I need to think, she said. He nodded, though she saw the disappointment flash across his face. Of course, I didn't mean to. That is, there's no obligation. Your position here is secure regardless. I know. She managed a small smile. You're a good man. Silas Brooke. Too good to settle for someone just because she can pull her weight and make decent biscuits. Francis. But she was already walking away, her mind whirling and her heart a confusion of hope and fear. Behind her, she left Silas standing in the yard, looking like a man who'd just gambled everything on a single throw of dice and wasn't sure yet whether he'd won or lost. Francis spent 3 restless days avoiding any moment alone with Silas. She rose earlier, stayed busy later, and found urgent tasks whenever he appeared in a doorway. The ranch hands noticed she caught Tom and Moses exchanging meaningful looks, but mercifully, no one commented. Her mind churned like butter in a dasher. Every time she thought of Silas's words, of the raw honesty in his eyes, her heart leaped, but then came the doubts, thick as morning fog. She'd been wrong about Alfred. What if she was wrong again? What if Silas's feelings were born of proximity and convenience rather than genuine affection? On the 4th morning, she was hanging laundry when a rider appeared on the horizon. As the figure drew closer, her stomach knotted. She recognized the elegant posture, the expensive riding habit. This was no ordinary visitor. The woman who dismounted in the yard was everything Francis wasn't petite. Graceful, with golden hair arranged in perfect ringlets despite the long ride. Her riding habit was deep blue velvet, tailored to show every curve to advantage. This could only be Clarice Whitmore, the woman from Silas's past. You must be the new housekeeper, Clarice said, her voice like honey over glass. Would you be a dear and tell Mr. Brooke that I'm here? Francis wiped her hands on her apron. He's out with the herd. Won't be back until evening. Then I'll wait. Clarice smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. We have business to discuss. Property business. Francis had no choice but to invite her in, to serve coffee in the good china, and sit across from this vision of feminine perfection while her own work-roughened hands seemed larger and clumsier than ever. I heard Silas has done well for himself, Clarice said, sipping delicately. The ranch is thriving, despite everything. Despite what? Oh, you know, the isolation, the lack of society, the hardness of it all. She laughed, a tinkling sound. I tried, truly I did, but I wasn't made for this life. All that mud and cattle and silence. I need civilization, culture, people who can discuss something besides livestock prices. Francis kept her voice neutral. Yet you're back. Business. As I said, Father left me some property adjoining Brook Hill. I need Silas's help sorting out the boundaries before I sell. She studied Francis over her cup. You're not at all what I expected in a housekeeper. Silas usually prefers smaller women. The barb hit home, but Francis had weathered worse. I do the work that needs doing. I'm sure you do. Clarice set down her cup. Tell me, has he mentioned me? We were engaged once. You know, everyone expected us to marry. Some say he's never gotten over it. Francis stood. I should check on dinner preparations. Of course. Clarice rose too, smoothing her skirts. I'll wait in the parlor. Oh, and dear, you might want to... She gestured vaguely at Francis's appearance. Tidy up a bit. First impressions matter so much. Don't they? Francis fled to the kitchen, her cheeks burning. She caught her reflection in the window glass, hair escaping from its pins, apron stained from the morning's work, hands red from lye soap. Next to Clarice's polished perfection, she looked exactly what she was, a working woman with no claim to beauty or grace. When Silas returned at sunset, Frances had retreated to the far corner of the kitchen, ostensibly working on the account books. She heard Clarice's musical laugh, Silas's deeper tones, the sound of papers rustling. Property business, she reminded herself. Nothing more. But Clarice stayed for supper, and watching them together was like swallowing glass. They had history written in every shared glance, every referenced memory. Clarice knew which stories would make him smile, which topics would draw him out. She was everything a rancher should want in a wife: beautiful, refined, connected. "Remember the harvest dance?" Clarice was saying. "You were so handsome in your Sunday suit. Every girl in town was jealous when you asked me for the first waltz." "That was a long time ago," Silas said quietly. "Not so long. And now look at you. Successful rancher, respected in the community. You've become everything we dreamed you'd be." She laid her hand on his arm. "Everything I knew you could be." Frances stood abruptly. "I'll clear the plates." "No." Silas's voice stopped her. "Clarice was just leaving." "But it's dark," Clarice protested. "Tom will escort you to town. He's heading that way anyway." His tone brooked no argument. Clarice's perfect composure cracked slightly. "Silas, surely we can—" "The boundaries are clear on the old surveyor's map. Your lawyer has a copy. There's nothing more to discuss." As Clarice gathered her things, she paused near Frances. "It was lovely meeting you, though I do hope Silas finds proper help soon. It must be such a burden, doing everything alone." After she left, the kitchen felt too quiet. Frances scrubbed dishes with unnecessary force, aware of Silas still sitting at the table. "She's very beautiful," Frances said finally. "She's very many things. The kind of woman a man like you should marry." She heard his chair scrape back. "Frances, look at me." She kept her eyes on the dishes. "There's work to finish." "The work can wait." He moved closer. "Please." Reluctantly, she turned. He stood near enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, a rare occurrence given her height. "Clarice is beautiful," he said steadily. "She's accomplished and refined and everything a successful rancher is supposed to want. And for a time, I thought I did want it. The picture-perfect wife, the social advancement, the whole package." Frances's heart sank. "Then she left," he continued. "And you know what I felt: relief. Like I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally breathe again. Because the truth was, I'd been trying to be someone I wasn't, wanting things I didn't actually want." "What do you want?" Frances whispered. "The truth." He stepped closer. "I want someone who sees a boy drowning and doesn't calculate the risk to her reputation before jumping in. I want someone who can birth a calf at dawn and still make biscuits that melt in your mouth by breakfast. I want someone who looks Harper dead in the eye and doesn't flinch when he implies she's not good enough." "Silas." "I want someone who's read books and can set a bone and doesn't need me to be anything other than what I'm: a rancher who'll never care about society dances or proper conversation, but will always make sure she has a roof over her head and honest work for her hands." Frances's eyes burned with unshed tears. "You don't know what you're saying. Men like you don't choose women like me." "This man does." He reached out, calloused fingers gentle on her cheek. "If she'll have him." "I'm too tall." "You're perfect height for me to look in the eyes." "I'm too strong." "Thank God for it. Weak women don't survive out here." "I'm not refined." "You're real. That's worth more than all the refinement in the world." Frances closed her eyes. "I'm scared. I was so wrong before. About Alfred. What if—" "Then we'll face it together. That's what partners do." The word broke something open in her chest. Not wife, not woman, but partner, equal. She opened her eyes to find him watching her with such patient hope it took her breath away. "I don't need much," she said carefully. But what I do need— Tell me. Respect. The freedom to be myself. To work alongside you, not just for you. A place that's mine, not just borrowed or granted on sufferance. She drew a breath. And promise you won't ask me to be smaller to make you feel bigger. Francis. His voice was rough with emotion. I don't want you smaller. I want you exactly as you are, taking up all the space you need. Standing tall, speaking your mind. The world tried to make you lesser. Don't let me be another person who tries to diminish you. She studied his face. This quiet man who'd seen her at her worst, soaked and freezing from the river and her best working sunrise to sunset without complaint. Who'd offered her shelter without conditions and never once suggested she should be other than what she was. Ask me again, she whispered. Hope blazed in his eyes. Francis May, will you marry me? Not because I need a housekeeper or because the neighbors expect it, but because I've fallen in love with the woman who makes this house a home, who makes me want to be a better man just by being herself. And if I say yes, what then? Then we go to town tomorrow and see the preacher, unless you want something fancier. She laughed, surprising herself. As if I've ever wanted fancy. Is that a yes? Instead of answering, she did something that would have scandalized proper society. She kissed him. Not a delicate press of lips, but a real kiss, full of promise and certainty. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw wonder in his eyes. Yes, she said firmly, though I have conditions. Name them. I keep working the ranch. I'm not going to suddenly take up embroidery and tea parties. Wouldn't want you to. And my name goes on the deed alongside yours. Legal partner, not just wife. He nodded without hesitation. Already had the papers drawn up. Been carrying them for a week. Hoping. That stopped her short. You have— Instead of answering, he went to his study and returned with a document. Sure enough, it was a deed amendment adding her name to the ranch property. Her hands shook as she read it. When? The day after the river, when I thought I'd lost you. All I could think was that I'd wasted so much time being careful, being proper. Life's too short and too uncertain to dance around what matters. Francis set the papers aside and framed his face with her work-worn hands. Then let's not waste any more time. That night, she lay in her narrow bed, formerly his bed. She remembered with a smile and thought about the twists that had brought her here. Tomorrow she would go to town as Francis May and return as Frances Brooke, the woman who'd boarded that train in Kansas, convinced she was too much for anyone to love. Seemed like a stranger now. Outside her window, snow began to fall again, but spring was coming. She could feel it in the wind, in the way the ice was breaking up on the river, in the new life stirring in her heart. Tomorrow would bring changes, challenges. Probably more visits from people like Clarice who thought she didn't belong. But tonight, she was exactly where she needed to be in a house that had become home, chosen by a man who saw her strength as a gift rather than a flaw. And that was more than enough. It was everything. The news of their engagement spread through Haven Ridge like wildfire in dry grass. By the time Francis and Silas returned from seeing Preacher Morrison, it seemed half the town had opinions about the match. Most weren't kind. That big woman finally caught herself a man. Francis overheard Mrs. Hartley saying at the general store, "Poor Silas Brooke. Must be desperate for help to take such a creature as a wife." Francis kept her chin high and selected her flower in silence. She'd expected this. What surprised her was the fierce protectiveness she felt not for herself, but for Silas. He didn't deserve to be pitied for choosing her. "Pay them no mind," Moses said quietly, appearing at her elbow. He'd accompanied her to town, and she suspected Silas had asked him to. Small minds got nothing better to do than flap their gums. "I'm used to it," Francis said. "That don't make it right." At the counter, Mr. Hartley tallied her purchases with obvious reluctance. "Here, congratulations are in order," he said stiffly. "Thank you." Francis kept her tone neutral. Though I must say, we all thought Silas would, well, that Miss Whitmore would surely... He trailed off at the look in her eyes. My money good enough for these goods. Mr. Hartley. He flushed. Of course. Then we're done here. Outside, Francis drew a deep breath of cold air. 3 more stops: the dressmaker, the blacksmith, and the feed store. She could manage. The dressmaker, Mrs. Donovan, was actually kind. I'll need your measurements for the wedding dress, she said. All business. Unless you're ordering from back east. No, I'd prefer to hire local. Frances had already decided against wearing the dove-gray dress from her failed engagement. This was a new beginning. It deserved new cloth. Mrs. Donovan measured efficiently. You're well-proportioned, she observed. Just need the right cut. I'm thinking something in blue, maybe brings out your eyes. Nothing fancy, Frances said quickly. It needs to be practical, something I can wear again. Every woman deserves something special for her wedding day. Leave it to me. At the blacksmith's, Frances found unexpected alliance. Big Jim Crawford, himself a mountain of a man, grinned when he saw her. Heard the news. About time Silas found himself a woman with backbone. That Whitmore filly would have blown away in the first strong wind. Thank you, Jim. You need anything, anyone gives you trouble, you let me know. He flexed one massive arm meaningfully. Some folks got too much time and too little sense. The feed store was the worst. A group of women had gathered there, including Clarice Whitmore herself, holding court like a wronged queen. I simply can't understand it, Clarice was saying as Frances entered. After everything we were to each other, for him to choose... She spotted Frances and let her words trail off suggestively. Miss Whitmore. Frances nodded politely and moved past to the counter. But Clarice followed. My dear, I do hope you know what you're getting into. Ranch life is so very hard, and Silas is such a particular man. He expects perfection in everything. Then he'll be disappointed, Frances said evenly. I'm far from perfect. Oh, but surely you plan to try to improve yourself for his sake. Frances turned to face her squarely. Miss Whitmore, I plan to be exactly who I am. If that's not enough, I'd rather know it now than spend a lifetime pretending to be something else. Clarice's smile turned sharp. How refreshingly honest. Though I wonder if Silas truly understands what he's giving up. Seems to me he's not giving up anything he wants to keep. The other women tittered nervously. Clarice's perfect complexion mottled with anger. But before she could respond, Tom Rivers entered the store. Miss Frances, you about done, boss wants us back before the snow starts. Just finishing up, Tom, as they loaded the wagon. Frances noticed Tom's satisfied smile. You were listening outside, weren't you? Maybe. He helped her up to the seat. That Whitmore woman's been needing someone to speak plain to her for years. Glad it was you. The ride back was quiet. Snow beginning to fall as they reached Brook Hill. Silas was waiting in the yard, and one look at her face told him everything. Bad? He asked quietly as he helped her down. No worse than expected. His jaw tightened. I should have gone with you. No. Frances touched his arm. I need to face them on my own terms, though I may have burned our bridge with the Whitmores. That bridge was ash long before you came along. He studied her face. You're sure about this? The talk won't stop just because we're married. Let them talk. Words don't break bones or stop crops growing. He smiled then, the slow smile that transformed his weathered face. That's my girl. The endearment warmed her more than any fire could. The next days passed in a blur of preparations. The ranch hands threw themselves into the work with enthusiasm, determined to make everything perfect. Will and Jake whitewashed the house. Carl repaired every squeaky board. Moses crafted a beautiful leather-bound Bible as a wedding gift. Even the weather cooperated, bringing clear skies and mild temperatures. The wedding day dawned bright and cold. Frances stood before the mirror in her room, hardly recognizing herself. Mrs. Donovan had worked magic with deep blue wool, creating a dress that was both practical and lovely. It fit perfectly, emphasizing her height rather than trying to disguise it. "You look beautiful." Tom's wife, Sarah, who'd come to help, fastened a simple pearl comb in Frances's hair. "That's my mother's, something borrowed." Frances touched the comb gently. "Thank you." "No, thank you. Tom's been happier these past months than I've seen him in years. Says you've brought life back to the ranch. To Silas, too." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Moses. "Boss is ready when you are, Miss Frances. Though I think he might pace a hole in the floor if you take much longer." Frances laughed. "Can't have that." The ceremony was small, held in the ranch's main room. Just the hands, their families, Preacher Morrison, and, surprisingly, Big Jim Crawford, who'd appointed himself her protector. Frances had expected to miss having family present, but looking at these faces weathered, honest, accepting, she realized she did have family. She'd built it over the winter, one shared meal and mended fence at a time. Silas waited by the fireplace, and when he saw her, his face lit up like sunrise. He wore his good suit, but what Frances noticed most was the way he stood proud, certain, like a man who knew exactly what he wanted and couldn't believe his good fortune in getting it. "Dearly beloved," Preacher Morrison began, but Frances barely heard the words. All her attention was on Silas. On the way, his hands were steady as they took hers, on the conviction in his voice as he spoke his vows. "I, Silas, take you, Frances, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, in joy as well as in sorrow. I promise to love and cherish you, to respect and honor you, to stand beside you as your partner in all things, from this day forward." He'd added that bit about partnership. She realized. Her throat tightened. When her turn came, her voice was clear and strong. "I, Frances, take you, Silas, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, in joy as well as in sorrow. I promise to love and cherish you, to work beside you, to build with you a life founded on mutual respect and trust, from this day forward." "The rings?" Preacher Morrison asked. Will stepped forward, nearly tripping in his eagerness, producing 2 simple gold bands. Frances hadn't expected a ring. Such things were luxuries ranch folk rarely indulged in. But Silas slipped it onto her finger like it was the most natural thing in the world. "With this ring I thee wed," he said softly. She repeated the words, sliding the larger band onto his work-roughened finger. It looked right there, like it had always belonged. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Silas cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Mrs. Brooke," he murmured, wonder in his voice. Then he kissed her, soft and sure, while the hands whooped and Sarah dabbed at her eyes. The celebration was simple but joyful. Sarah and the other wives had prepared a feast. There was music. Carl played fiddle with surprising skill, and dancing in the cleared main room. Frances found herself passed from partner to partner, even shy Jake taking a turn. "Never thought I'd see the boss this happy," Tom said as he guided her through a reel. "You're good for him. Miss Frances, Mrs. Frances, I should say." "He's good for me too," Frances said, watching Silas dance with Sarah, his movements careful but determined. As the afternoon wore on, the wives and children gradually departed. The hands retreated to the bunkhouse with knowing grins and a bottle of whiskey Tom had been saving. Finally, Frances and Silas were alone. They stood in the kitchen, suddenly awkward as the reality of their new situation settled over them. "I should clean up," Frances said, gesturing at the dishes. "Leave them," Silas caught her hand. Please, you've worked hard enough today. What then? He was quiet for a moment. Are you happy, Francis, truly? She considered the question seriously. Yes, happier than I've ever been. Are you no regrets about choosing someone who'll never be a proper society wife? My only regret is that I didn't find you sooner. He touched the scar on his cheek. A gesture she'd learned meant he was thinking hard. I need to tell you something. About Clarice. About why we really ended. You don't owe me explanations about the past. I want you to know. He led her to the sofa, keeping hold of her hand. Everyone thinks she left because ranch life was too hard. That's what we let them think. The truth is uglier. Francis waited, feeling the tension in his grip. She wanted me to change everything. Sell the ranch, move to Denver, use her father's connections to go into banking. When I refused, she tried to force my hand, started spreading rumors that we were already married, that I'd compromised her reputation, thought I'd have to marry her to save her honor. Francis sucked in a breath. What did you do? Called her bluff, said if she wanted to claim we were married, she could explain why she was living in town while her supposed husband was at the ranch. The rumors died quick after that, but the damage was done. People either pitied me or thought I was a fool. Been living with that for 3 years. And now they'll think you're a bigger fool for choosing me. Let them. His grip tightened. I know the truth. You're worth 12 Clarice Whitmores. 100. You're real. Francis, do you know how rare that is? She freed one hand to touch his face. Thank you for telling me. No more secrets between us. We're partners now. Partners. She agreed. Then, gathering courage. Speaking of which, where exactly do partners sleep? Color rose in his cheeks. I thought, that is, you could keep your room if you prefer. I don't want to presume. Silas Brooke, she interrupted. Are you trying to tell me you married me just to keep your housekeeper? No, I want you to be comfortable, to not feel rushed. Francis stood, pulling him up with her. Do you know what would make me comfortable not sleeping in a narrow bed in a small room when there's a perfectly good master bedroom down the hall? Unless, she faltered, unless you'd prefer to keep separate rooms. God, no. The words burst out of him. I just didn't want to assume. You've been through enough with people trying to force you into their mold. I won't be another. She kissed him then, pouring all her certainty into it. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she smiled. Then take me to our room. Husband, I think I've slept in other people's beds long enough. He led her down the hall to the master bedroom, opening the door to reveal a large, comfortable space she'd only cleaned, never entered as an equal. The bed was big, solid oak that he'd built himself, he told her shyly. New sheets, she noticed. New quilt too, one of Sarah's, given as a wedding gift. Francis, he said softly, that first night when you said you'd never slept in a man's bed. I remember. I promised you a good night's rest. That promise stands. Tonight and always. You set the pace here. I'm just grateful you're willing to share my life. Francis felt tears prick her eyes. This good, patient man who saw her truly, who offered partnership instead of possession, respect instead of mere desire. I love you, she said, the words new on her tongue but feeling ancient in her heart. I didn't know I could, after Alfred, but you've shown me different. Shown me what it means to be valued for who I am, not who someone wants me to become. I love you too, he said, reverent as a prayer. My tall, strong, brave Francis, who pulls boys from rivers and doesn't suffer fools, who makes a house a home just by being in it. As she stepped into his arms, their room, their bed, their life together, Francis thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the bitter disappointment of a broken engagement to this moment of perfect belonging. She'd traveled so far to find not just a job or a roof, but a true partner, someone who saw her height as something to admire, her strength as an asset. her stubbornness as proof of character. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be more whispers, more Clarice Whitmores, more Boyd Harpers suggesting she wasn't good enough. But tonight, in the circle of Silas's arms, in the home they would build together, she was exactly where she belonged. And that was more than good enough. It was perfect. The winter church social was the first real test of Frances's new status as Mrs. Brooke. She stood before the mirror, adjusting the collar of her good dress, the blue one from her wedding, pressed and cleaned for the occasion. Her hands, she noticed, trembled slightly. "You don't have to go," Silas said from the doorway. He'd been ready for 20 minutes, watching her with concerned eyes. "We could stay home." "And let them think they've run me off." Frances squared her shoulders. "No, we're going." The church was warm and bright with lanterns when they arrived, the sound of fiddle music and laughter spilling out into the cold night. Frances felt the shift in atmosphere the moment they entered, conversations faltering, heads turning, whispers starting. "Chin up," Silas murmured, his hand warm at the small of her back. "We belong here as much as anyone." Reverend Morrison greeted them warmly, as did Big Jim Crawford and his wife. But Frances could feel the weight of other stares, particularly from the cluster of women near the refreshment table where Clarice Whitmore held court in rose silk. "Let's get some cider," Silas suggested, steering her toward a quieter corner. They were intercepted by Mrs. Hartley, the store owner's wife, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Why, Mrs. Brooke, how nice to see you. That's such a practical dress. So suitable for someone of your position." "Thank you," Frances said evenly. "Practicality serves me well." "I'm sure it does, though I imagine you must miss having time for finer things. What with all that ranch work, I heard you were out mending fences just yesterday. So unusual for a married woman." "My wife does whatever needs doing," Silas said, his tone mild but firm. "That's one of the many things I admire about her." "Mrs. Hartley's smile faltered. "Of course, how modern." As she fluttered away, Frances caught movement from the corner of her eye. A small boy, perhaps 6 years old, had wandered too close to the refreshment table. His reaching hand knocked into the punch bowl, sending it teetering toward the edge. Without thinking, Frances lunged forward, catching the heavy crystal bowl just before it crashed to the floor. Punch sloshed over her hands and onto her dress, but the bowl was saved. "Oh!" The boy's mother rushed forward. "Mrs. Garrett, the banker's wife. Timothy, what have you—" "Oh, Mrs. Brooke, your dress." "It's nothing," Frances said, setting the bowl safely back. "No harm done. But you're soaked, and you moved so fast I've never seen—" "Mrs." Garrett trailed off, looking at Frances with something like wonder. "Thank you." "Anyone would have done the same." "No, Mrs." Garrett said quietly. "They wouldn't have. Most would have stepped back to save their dress." Sarah Rivers appeared with towels, and soon Frances found herself surrounded by women, not the sharp-tongued gossips, but the working wives, the mothers, the practical women who valued quick reflexes over perfect ringlets. "That was well done," said Mrs. O'Brien, the blacksmith's wife. "These socials are torture with little ones. Last month my Margaret nearly brought down the entire dessert table." "Children are quick," Frances agreed, dabbing at her skirt. "You have to be quicker." "Do you have younger siblings, Mrs.?" Garrett asked. "3 brothers. I was the eldest, so I learned early to have eyes in the back of my head." The women laughed, and suddenly Frances found herself drawn into their circle, talking about children and gardens and the challenges of keeping a house when men tracked in half the ranch. Across the room, she caught Silas's eye. He was talking with Tom and some other ranchers, but he'd been watching her. The pride in his expression made her stand taller. "Would you teach me that?" a young voice piped up. Frances looked down to find Timothy Garrett gazing at her with wide eyes. Teach you what? How to catch things like that. You were fast as lightning. His mother started to scold, but Francis smiled. It's mostly about watching. See how people move, where things might fall. Want me to show you? For the next half hour, she found herself surrounded by children, teaching them a game her brothers used to play, rolling apples across the floor and catching them before they hit the wall. Parents gathered to watch, and Francis overheard more than one comment about her natural way with the little ones. She'll make a wonderful mother, someone murmured. Francis's hand instinctively went to her stomach. It was too early to be certain, but she'd been wondering lately. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. The music started up again for dancing. Silas appeared at her elbow. May I have this dance, Mrs. Brooke? I've got punch on my dress, she warned. Then we'll match. I've got mud on my boots. He led her to the floor, ignoring the looks from Clarice's corner. You were wonderful with those children. I like them. They're honest. Unlike their parents sometimes. He spun her carefully. I heard what Mrs. Hartley said. I'm sorry. Don't be. The women who matter were kind. She smiled. Mrs. Garrett wants my receipt for apple preserves. And Mrs. O'Brien offered to teach me her mother's pattern for knitting socks. See, you're building bridges. Speaking of building, Francis lowered her voice. I've been thinking, that empty land by the creek. What if we put up a schoolhouse? Silas missed a step. A school? The nearest one is 10 miles away. Too far for the little ones, especially in winter. We could build something simple, find a teacher. The ranch children need education, and so do the neighbors. That's... He spun her again, buying time to think. That's ambitious. Too ambitious. No, just right for you. He smiled. We'll talk to Tom. See what lumber we can spare. Might have to wait until after spring roundup. I can wait. Good things are worth waiting for. They danced in comfortable silence, ignoring the whispers, the stares, the occasional sniff of disapproval. Francis had learned something important tonight. There were two kinds of people in Haven Ridge. Those who would always see her as too much too tall, too strong, too unwilling to shrink, and those who saw those same qualities as strengths. The second group was smaller, but they were the ones who mattered, as if summoned by her thoughts about honesty. Timothy Garrett tugged at her skirt. Mrs. Brooke, why are you so tall? Timothy, his mother looked mortified. But Francis knelt to the boy's level. Why do you think? He considered seriously. Maybe so you can reach high things or see far. Both good reasons. But mostly, she leaned in conspiratorially. I think God made me tall so I could catch punch bowls before they crash. Timothy giggled. And maybe to help people who can't reach? Exactly right. The boy beamed and scampered off. When Francis stood, she found several people watching not with mockery, but with something approaching respect. The social wound down near 10 o'clock. As Silas helped her with her coat, Clarice Whitmore approached. Francis braced herself. That was quite a display, Clarice said, her voice carrying, playing with children on the floor. How quaint. Children appreciate honest interaction. Francis replied calmly. I suppose someone has to entertain them, though I'd have thought a woman in your position would try to maintain more dignity. Funny, Francis said, buttoning her coat. I'd have thought dignity meant being useful rather than ornamental. Clarice's perfect complexion flushed. You may have caught Silas with your practical nature, but don't think that makes you one of us. You'll always be the hired help who got above herself. No, Silas said quietly, stepping beside Francis. She's my wife, my partner, and worth 10 of anyone who thinks a person's value lies in their ability to stand around looking pretty while doing nothing useful. The room had gone quiet, everyone watching. Clarice opened her mouth, closed it, then swept away with what dignity she could muster. In the wagon going home, Francis sat quiet, processing the evening. "You're thinking loud," Silas observed. "Just wondering if I'll ever fit in. You fit where it matters. With me, at the ranch, with the people who see your worth." He reached over, took her hand. "The rest will come around or they won't. Either way, we'll build our life." The schoolhouse idea was overreaching. "No, it's needed, and you're the kind of person who sees what's needed and does it. That's not overreaching. That's leading." Francis squeezed his hand. "I love you." "Love you back, punch stains and all." They rode in comfortable silence until the ranch came into view, windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Home, Francis thought. Not just a place to work or shelter, but truly home. As Silas helped her down from the wagon, she noticed his expression had turned serious. "What is it?" "Just thinking how lucky I am. 6 months ago, I was resigned to running this place alone. Now I have a partner who saves punch bowls, teaches children, and dreams about building schools." He cupped her face gently. "You've brought this ranch back to life." "Francis brought me back to life." "We brought each other back," she corrected. "That's what partners do." Inside, as she hung up her punch-stained dress, Francis reflected on the evening. Yes, there had been cuts and slights. There would be more, but there had also been laughter, acceptance, and the joy of children who didn't care if she was too tall or too strong, only that she would get down on their level and play. And perhaps that was the secret, not trying to fit into the narrow mold others created, but building something new, a life where a woman could mend fences in the morning and dance at socials at night, where being useful mattered more than being ornamental, where partnership meant exactly that, two people, building together. She thought again of that flutter she'd been feeling lately, the suspicion growing stronger each day. If she was right, by next winter's social there might be a little one of their own. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, she had a warm house, a good husband, and the satisfaction of knowing she'd held her head high despite everything thrown at her. And that punch bowl, not a drop spilled, that mattered. Sometimes the quick hands that came from years of hard work served better than all the etiquette lessons in the world. Francis smiled, blew out the lamp, and went to find her husband. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, it always did, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged. The conversation began over breakfast on a quiet Thursday morning. Francis had been kneading bread when the familiar doubts crept in, the ones that visited her in the pre-dawn darkness when Silas was already out with the herd. "Do you love people the way I do?" The question escaped before she could call it back. Silas looked up from his coffee, studying her with those careful eyes that missed nothing. "What brought this on?" Francis shaped the dough with more force than necessary. "Mrs. Hartley was in town yesterday. Said something about how you could have had your pick of women, refined women, small, delicate women who know how to pour tea and embroider cushions." "Francis. And she's not wrong." "Is she? You're successful, respected. You could have married someone who fits better into society. Someone who doesn't tower over other women or have hands rougher than half the ranch hands." She stopped kneading, flour-dusted fingers gripping the table edge. "Someone people don't whisper about." Silas set down his cup with deliberate care. "Look at me." When she didn't, he rose and came around the table, gently turning her to face him. Flour smudged her cheek where she'd pushed back a strand of hair. Mrs. Hartley doesn't know what I want or need. Neither does anyone else in that town." His voice was low, intense. "You ask if I love people like you do know. I love you specifically, not some idea of what a wife should be. But if you could choose..." "I did choose. Every morning I wake up and choose again." He caught her flour-covered hands in his. "If God himself came down and offered me my pick of any woman in creation, small, delicate, knows all the social graces, I'd still choose the one who pulls drowning boys from rivers, who sets bones and builds fences and makes biscuits that could make angels weep."
Silas.
I'd choose the woman who looks me in the eye instead of up at me like I'm some kind of giant. The one who doesn't need me to feel complete but wants me anyway. The one who's already planning a schoolhouse for children she hasn't even met yet because she sees need and moves to fill it. Francis felt tears threaten. I'm not graceful. I don't know how to host teas or plan social events. I can't make small talk about fashion or gossip about neighbors. Thank God for that. He brushed flour from her cheek. You know what you can do. You can birth a calf at 3 in the morning and have breakfast on the table by 6. You can manage a household and a ranch crew and still find time to teach Will his letters because you noticed he couldn't read. You can stand up to bullies like Harper and shrews like Clarice without losing your dignity. Those aren't the things society values in a woman. Then society's a fool. His hands moved to cup her face. Francis, I spent 3 years with a woman who knew all the graces, who could pour tea with her pinky just so and embroider flowers that looked real enough to smell. And you know what? I was miserable, because beneath all that polish was nothing but empty ambition and cruel calculation. He pressed his forehead to hers. You're real. You're strong. You're kind. You see work that needs doing and do it. You treat the ranch hands with respect and they'd walk through fire for you. You're building a life here, not just playing house. But the whispers will always exist. There will always be small people who try to make others feel small too. He pulled back to look at her. But here's what I know when roundup comes. I want you beside me, not some delicate flower who'd faint at the sight of blood. When winter storms hit, I want a partner who'll help me save the stock, not someone worried about her complexion. When we have children. He stopped, color rising in his cheeks. They hadn't spoken of it yet, though Francis suspected he'd noticed the changes in her routine, the careful way she'd been moving lately. When we have children, she continued softly, you want someone who won't break. I want someone who'll teach them to be strong, to be kind, to work hard and stand tall and never apologize for being exactly who they are. His thumb traced her jaw. I want their mother to be you. Francis closed her eyes against the emotion welling up. Even if I'm too much? You're not too much. You're exactly enough. Exactly right. He kissed her forehead. The world tried to convince you that you needed to be less to be loved. But I need all of you, every inch, every stubborn notion, every calloused finger. You make me sound better than I am. No, I see you clear. The good and the difficult and everything in between. He smiled. Though you do snore something fierce when you're overtired. That startled a laugh from her. I do not. Like a sawmill. But I'd rather listen to you snore than have anyone else's pretty singing. Francis leaned into him, letting his certainty wash over her doubts. I worry sometimes that you'll wake up one day and realize you could have done better. Better than a woman who loves me, who works beside me, who makes me laugh and keeps me honest and isn't afraid of hard truth. He shook his head. There is no better. Francis, there's just different. And I don't want different. I want you. Even when I doubt. Especially then, means you're thinking, questioning. Rather have that than blind certainty any day. He pulled back, hands still on her shoulders. Now, you asked if I love people like you do. Truth is, I don't love easy. Never have. Takes me time to trust, to open up. But you changed that. Made me want to be better at it. How? By example. The way you are with Will. Teaching him his letters without making him feel ashamed for not knowing. The way you tend Moses' arthritis without him having to ask. The way you treat every person like they matter. From Big Jim Crawford down to the youngest Murphy boy. He smiled. You love practical. You see need and fill it. That's worth more than all the tea parties in the world. Francis felt the knot in her chest loosen. Mrs. Hartley would disagree. Oh, Mrs. Hartley can go soak her head. The crude expression from proper Silas made her laugh again. I mean it. Her and all her kind. They produce nothing but gossip and misery. You produce bread and preserves and mended clothes and healthy cattle and... He paused, giving her a meaningful look. Anything else you might be producing? Frances felt heat rise in her cheeks. It's too early to be certain, but not too early to hope. No, not too early for that. His face transformed, joy breaking across it like sunrise. Frances, really? Maybe, probably. She touched her still flat stomach. Are you happy? Happy. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around the kitchen. There aren't words. Scared too, if I'm honest, but mostly happy. Put me down before you hurt yourself. She laughed. I'm not exactly light. You're exactly right, he corrected, setting her down gently. And our children will be too, tall and strong and unafraid. What if people are cruel to them for having me as a mother? Then we'll teach them what you've taught me, that cruel people are usually small people, afraid of anyone who shows them up just by existing. He cradled her face again. Our children will know their worth doesn't come from fitting into narrow molds. It comes from being useful, being kind, being true. Frances leaned into his touch. I love you, even when I doubt myself. I never doubt that. Good. Hold on to that when the whispers get loud. He glanced at the bread dough, abandoned on the table. Now, you going to finish that bread? Or should I expect hardtack for dinner? She swatted him with a floury hand. Get on with you. Some of us have real work to do. Yes, ma'am. He headed for the door, then turned back. Frances, next time Mrs. Hartley or anyone else tries to make you feel less than, remember that I chose you. Would choose you again every day for the rest of my life. Not because I couldn't do better, but because there is no better. There's only you. After he left, Frances returned to her bread, kneading with renewed energy. The doubts would come again, they always did. In the small hours when the world felt too big and she felt too different. But she had his words now, solid and true as the mountains that ringed their valley. She thought of the potential life growing within her, the children who would run through this kitchen with dirty feet and loud laughter. They would be different too, probably. Too tall, too strong, too much of something or other. But they would know they were loved exactly as they were. The bread dough became smooth and elastic under her hands. Good bread took time, took work, took patience with the process. Like building a life, like building a family, like learning to stand tall in a world that kept trying to make you hunch. Through the window, she could see Silas talking with Tom by the corral. He must have said something about their conversation, because Tom looked her way and touched his hat with a grin. Good people, she thought. People who measured worth in work and character, not in fitting prescribed molds. You hear that? She whispered to her belly, though it was far too early for any response. Your daddy chooses us, every single day. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came, it brought changes to Brook Hill Ranch. The most visible was Frances herself, her condition now apparent despite the loose work dresses she favored. The ranch hands treated her with a mixture of awe and protective concern that both amused and frustrated her. I can still gather eggs, she told Will firmly one morning when she found him hovering by the chicken coop. Being with child doesn't make me fragile. Mr. Silas said, Mr. Silas worries too much, and so do you. She softened the words with a smile. Though I appreciate the concern, it was a constant negotiation, maintaining her independence while acknowledging that some tasks were becoming difficult. Silas had taken to watching her with eagle eyes, appearing whenever she lifted anything heavier than a dinner plate. I worked until the day I delivered all 4 of my children, Sarah Rivers told her during one of her visits. Ranch women don't have the luxury of lying about like city ladies. You do what you can, rest when you must, and don't let the men fuss you into uselessness. It was good advice, though harder to follow as summer progressed. The heat that year was fierce, and Frances found herself grateful when Moses quietly took over the heavier washing without saying a word, or when Tom's wife appeared with meals on the days when standing over the stove felt impossible. The question of her future role sat heavy between her and Silas, unspoken but present. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching thunderheads build over the mountains, Frances finally broached it. "After the baby comes," she began carefully. "What then?" Silas turned from his contemplation of the sky. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do I go back to being just the housekeeper? Do I stay in the house like a proper mother should, do I?" "Stop." He reached for her hand. "First, you were never just the housekeeper. Second, since when have you cared about doing what proper mothers should?" "Since I became responsible for more than myself." She placed her free hand on her rounded belly. "What if people say, 'Let me ask you something'?" Silas interrupted. "What kind of mother do you want to be?" Frances considered. The kind mine was, present but not hovering, teaching by example, showing that work has dignity, that strength isn't just physical. "Then, be that mother. Our child will need to see you being yourself, not some watered-down version trying to fit others' expectations. But the ranch work will still need doing. Maybe not the heavy lifting for a while, but your mind, your management, your skills, those don't disappear with motherhood." He squeezed her hand. "I didn't marry you to lock you in the house. Frances, I married you because you're my partner. That doesn't change with children. It just means we figure out new ways to work together." Thunder rumbled closer, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. As they moved inside, Frances felt something ease in her chest. The future was uncertain, but Silas's certainty about her place in it was rock solid. That certainty was tested 3 weeks later when she went into labor during the August cattle drive. Silas was 20 miles away with most of the hands, moving the herd to fresh grazing. Only Moses and Will had stayed behind, and it was Will who found her gripping the porch rail, face white with pain. "Should I ride for Mrs. Rivers?" he asked, panic in his young voice. "No time," Frances managed. "Babies, impatient. Get Moses and boil water, lots of it." What followed were some of the longest hours of her life. Moses, calm as always, sent Will for the nearest neighbor woman while he helped Frances inside. Mrs. Murphy arrived just as the pains were getting severe, took one look at the situation, and set about with practiced efficiency. "First baby?" she asked, though she likely knew the answer from town gossip. "Yes." "Always the hardest. You're built strong, though. Wide hips. You'll do fine." It didn't feel fine. It felt like being split in half. But Frances had never backed down from hard work, and she didn't intend to start now. When Mrs. Murphy told her to push, she pushed. When the pain threatened to overwhelm her, she thought of Silas, somewhere under the wide sky, trusting her to handle whatever came. The baby arrived just as the sun was setting, filling the room with golden light. "A girl, Mrs. Murphy announced, healthy and loud and perfect. "She's got your height already," the woman said with a smile, placing the baby in Frances's arms. "Look at those long legs." Frances looked down at her daughter, and felt her heart crack open and reform around this tiny person. She was indeed long, with a cap of dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything already. "Welcome to the world, little one," Frances whispered. "You're going to be too tall and too strong and too much of everything, and that's exactly right." Moses had sent Will riding hard for Silas, and he arrived near midnight, horse lathered and eyes wild. Frances heard him taking the stairs 3 at a time. "Frances," he burst through the door, then stopped short at the sight of her propped up in bed, the baby at her breast. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. He approached like a man in a dream, sinking to his knees beside the bed. With one trembling finger, he touched the baby's cheek. "She's perfect," he breathed. "You're perfect, are you? Was it?" "Hard," Frances admitted. "But we managed. Women have been doing this work since Eve. though I'll admit I have new respect for every mother I've ever known. I should have been here. You were where you needed to be. We were fine. She smiled at his expression. Though I'm glad you're here now. Can I? He gestured toward the baby. Francis transferred their daughter to his arms, watching as this strong man went completely soft at the weight of 7 pounds of humanity. What should we call her? He asked. Francis had been thinking about this. Margaret, after your grandmother, but we'll call her Maggie. She looks like a Maggie, doesn't she? Maggie Brooke. Silas tested the name. Strong name for what's sure to be a strong girl. Over the next days, the ranch transformed around the reality of baby Maggie. The hands walked softer, talked quieter, and competed to see who could make her smile first. Moses carved a beautiful cradle. Tom's wife brought enough baby clothes for triplets. Even Krusty Carl was caught singing lullabies while fixing the garden gate. But the real test came when Francis ventured into town for the first time with Maggie. She'd expected stares and whispers, she got them. What she hadn't expected was Mrs. Garrett practically running across the street to peer into the sling where Maggie nestled. Oh, she's beautiful. Look at those eyes, Mrs. Garrett cooed. And so alert already. You can tell she's going to be clever. Other women gathered. And for once, Frances found herself at the center of approving attention. Babies, it seemed, were universal currency. She's going to be tall like her mother, someone observed. Good. Big Jim Crawford's wife said firmly. World needs more strong women. Too many flowers, not enough trees. Even Mrs. Hartley, when she encountered them at the general store, seemed subdued. Congratulations, she said stiffly. She seems healthy. Very, Frances agreed. Would you like to hold her? The surprise on Mrs. Hartley's face was almost worth the months of cutting remarks. She took Maggie gingerly, and something in her expression softened as the baby grabbed her finger. I had 3 boys, she said quietly. Always wanted a daughter. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Frances took it for what it was, a small bridge built over the divide of judgment and misunderstanding. As fall arrived and Maggie grew, Frances found her rhythm. She carried the baby in a sling while she worked, setting her in the cradle Moses had made when she needed both hands. The kitchen became command central, with Frances directing ranch operations while kneading bread or stirring stew, Maggie watching everything with those alert eyes. She's learning already, Silas observed one evening, watching Maggie track Frances's movements as she worked, taking it all in. Good. She'll need to know how to do more than pour tea and simper. Frances tempered the edge in her voice. Not that there's anything wrong with tea, but life requires more. Our life certainly does. He lifted Maggie from her cradle, holding her up so she could see out the window to where the sun was setting over their land. See that, little one? That's your inheritance. Not just the land, but the work, the purpose, the knowledge that you're building something real. Frances joined them at the window, Silas's arm coming around her automatically. Think she'll want it this life? I think she'll want whatever life she chooses, but she'll know she has choices. That's what will give her the strength to choose, not just accept. Even if she chooses tea parties and embroidery, Silas chuckled. Even then, though somehow, looking at her, I doubt that's where she's headed. As if in agreement, Maggie reached out one small fist toward the window, toward the wide world beyond, already grasping for something bigger than what others might expect of her. That's my girl, Frances whispered. Reach high, take up space, be too much of everything good. Standing there in the fading light, their daughter in their arms and their land spread before them. Frances felt the last of her doubts fade. This was where she belonged, not because she'd made herself fit, but because she'd helped build something that fit her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Maggie would grow, would face her own struggles with being different, but she would face them knowing she was loved exactly as she was. by parents who had chosen each other not despite their differences, but because of them. And that foundation, Frances thought, was worth more than all the social approval in the world. The last winter storm of the year arrived on Maggie's first birthday, blanketing Brook Hill Ranch in fresh snow. Frances stood at the kitchen window, watching Silas and the hands work to secure the livestock. Her daughter played at her feet, stacking wooden blocks Moses had carved, already showing the determined concentration that marked a brook. "Mama up," Maggie demanded, raising her arms. Frances lifted her, settling the child on her hip with practiced ease. Through the window, they watched Silas directing operations, his breath clouding in the cold air. "That's Papa," Frances told Maggie, who pressed small hands against the glass, "working hard to keep us all safe and warm." The past year had brought changes beyond counting. The schoolhouse she'd dreamed of now stood near the creek, simple but solid, with a young teacher from Denver who boarded with the Murphys. Frances had overseen its construction while carrying Maggie on her back, ignoring the townspeople who said a mother's place was in the home. "A mother's place is wherever she's needed," she'd told Mrs. Hartley firmly. And, surprisingly, the woman had nodded slowly, something like understanding in her eyes. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Frances opened it to find a woman she didn't recognize, thin, tired-looking, with a baby in her arms and a young boy clinging to her skirts. "Please," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard. They said in town you might help. My husband died in a mining accident. I have nowhere else to go." Frances didn't hesitate. "Come in. You're letting the cold in with you." The woman Ellen Thorne, she learned, had walked 5 miles in the snow after being evicted from company housing. Her story was all too common: husband killed, no family, nowhere to turn. "I can work," Ellen said desperately, as Frances settled her by the fire with hot coffee. "I can cook, clean, sew. I just need, my children need—" "What you need," Frances said firmly, "is rest. We'll sort the rest later." When Silas came in an hour later, he found their kitchen transformed into a makeshift nursery. Ellen dozed in a chair while Frances entertained both babies and Ellen's boy, Thomas, with a story about brave cowboys and strong women. Silas took in the scene, then simply asked, "What do they need?" This was why she loved him. Frances thought, no questions about taking in strangers, no worries about what people would say. Just what do they need? "Work," Frances said. "A place. Hope. The old foreman's cottage is empty. Needs fixing up, but it's solid. She can help with the house and garden. Lord knows you could use the help with this one getting into everything." He tickled Maggie, who shrieked with delight. Ellen woke at the sound, fear flashing across her face until she saw Silas's kind expression. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat. "Welcome to Brook Hill. We take care of our own here." The woman burst into tears. Over the following weeks, Ellen proved her worth 10 times over. She was a hard worker, quiet but steady, and her gratitude transformed into fierce loyalty. The ranch hands accepted her immediately. Moses fixed up the cottage, Tom's wife provided furniture, and Will appointed himself honorary big brother to young Thomas. But not everyone approved. The first Sunday, Ellen accompanied them to church. Whispers followed their group like buzzing flies. "Taking in strays now," someone muttered, as if that Brooks woman wasn't scandal enough. Frances kept her chin high, one hand on Ellen's elbow, the other carrying Maggie. Let them whisper. She'd learned the difference between noise and substance. After the service, Clarice Whitmore approached, her new husband in tow, a banker from Cheyenne who looked as soft as new bread. "How charitable of you," Clarice said, her smile sharp. "Though one wonders if it's wise, exposing your daughter to such influences. The only influence Maggie's exposed to is hard work and human kindness." Frances replied evenly, both of which seem in short supply in some circles. Clarice's husband tugged her away, but not before she delivered a parting shot. Pride goeth before a fall, Mrs. Brooke. Even tall women can be brought low. Maybe, Frances agreed. But at least I'll fall doing something worthwhile. That afternoon, as the women prepared Sunday dinner together, Ellen said quietly, "You didn't have to defend me." "Yes, I did. Same as I'd expect you to defend me." Frances handed her a bowl. "That's what family does." Family. Ellen tested the word like she'd forgotten its taste. "I haven't had family since—" "You do now," Frances said firmly. "Chosen family, maybe, but just as real." The truth of those words was proven over the coming months. When spring arrived and Frances discovered she was expecting again, it was Ellen who helped her through the difficult early weeks. When Ellen's boy came down with fever, it was Frances who sat up all night with cool cloths and prayers. The ranch thrived with their combined efforts. The house ran smoother than ever. The garden produced abundantly. And there was laughter where once there had been only quiet efficiency. "You've built something special here," Sarah Rivers observed one day, watching the children play while the women worked. Not just a household, but a community. Frances considered this as she kneaded bread Ellen beside her preparing vegetables, Maggie helping by banging a wooden spoon, Thomas carefully practicing his letters at the table. "My mother used to say that strong women don't compete, they complete," she said, "each one filling gaps, sharing strengths. I didn't understand then. I do now." The second baby came easier than the first a boy this time, with Silas's quiet intensity already apparent in his dark eyes. They named him James, for Big Jim Crawford, who'd stood by them when others hadn't. "Getting quite a dynasty going," Tom observed, bouncing James while Maggie demanded her own turn holding her brother. "Just getting started," Silas said, and the look he gave Frances promised more shared adventures ahead. As summer turned to fall, Frances stood once again at her kitchen window, but the view had changed. The schoolhouse rang with children's voices. The foreman's cottage showed smoke from its chimney where Ellen was teaching a group of women to read a secret project Frances had helped organize. The ranch hands worked alongside neighbors who'd once whispered but now came seeking advice on everything from cattle diseases to difficult births. "We did it," she said to Silas that evening as they sat on the porch, children asleep, the ranch quiet around them. "Did what?" "Built something real, not just a ranch or a family, but a place where people can be themselves, where being different isn't a failing, but a strength." He pulled her close. "You did that, by being yourself first, by refusing to shrink." "I had help." She leaned into his warmth. "A man who saw me true and didn't flinch, who gave me ground to stand on and sky to reach for." "Partnership," he said, echoing their old promise. "The best kind." As stars emerged overhead, Frances thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a too-tall girl in Kansas who couldn't find a place to fit, to a woman who'd helped build a place where fitting wasn't required, just contributing, just being real, just standing tall in whatever way you could manage. Tomorrow there would be new challenges. The children would grow and face their own battles with expectations and limitations. The community they'd built would be tested by droughts and storms, both literal and figurative. There would always be Clarice Whitmores in the world, trying to make others feel small. But tonight, in this house built on partnership and filled with chosen family, with her husband beside her and their children dreaming whatever dreams strong children dare to dream, Frances Brooke knew she was exactly where and who she was meant to be. And that was more than enough. It was everything. In the distance, a coyote called to the moon, and Frances smiled. Even wild things knew the value of standing tall and calling out your truth to the night. She'd learned that lesson well, and she'd teach it to everyone who found shelter under their roof. After all, the world needed more strong women and men strong enough to stand beside them without feeling diminished. Together, they were building a place where both could thrive. The lamp burned low as they finally went inside, but the light they'd kindled of acceptance, of partnership, of love without conditions that would burn bright for generations to come. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss your thoughts on Francis and Silas's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of love, strength, and standing tall in the face of adversity, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit the like button. And don't forget to press the hype button so more people can discover and enjoy this story. Your support means everything and helps bring more authentic Western tales to life. Until next time, keep standing tall, partners.